The 2018 Daytona 24 Hours has been featured in this series before. It's where Lando Norris made his sports car debut together with Fernando Alonso. But they weren't the only current F1 drivers on the grid. Somewhere further up the field was the number 37 Orca 07 and its drivers, one of which being the topic of today's video, Lance Stroll. Unlike Norris though, Stroll already did the 24-hour race once before. So how did he perform? And how did he end up racing for Jackie Chan? Stroll's first appearance at the Daytona 24 Hour was in 2016. At this point in his career, Stroll had only been racing lower class Formula cars for 2 years, but he already had a decent track record, having won the Italian F4 Championship in 2014 and in 2015 finished a respectable 5th in the European Formula 3 Championship after winning the Toyota Racing Series in New Zealand earlier that year in the winter period. It's for the same reason Stroll accepted the Daytona drive. That race always happens in late January, so it's a good method of keeping his racing skills fresh during the Formula Racing off-season. Stroll's dad was probably a big influence as he got his son a seat at one of his friend's racing teams. That friend was Chip Ganassi. They've known each other for over 25 years. Now if you somehow never heard of Chip Ganassi before, let me give you a quick rundown of his racing team, the creatively called Chip Ganassi Racing Team. Originally founded as an open-wheel racing team for the American Kart Championship in 1990, it rather quickly expanded into pretty much everything. Over the years they've won the Daytona 500, the Indy 500, Sebring 12 Hours, the Le Mans 24 Hours in class, achieved numerous championship wins in IndyCar, Kart, the Grand Am and IMSA Sports Car Championship, and even have some off-road racing pedigree, having raced in the Global Rallycross and currently in Extreme E. The still only 17-year-old Lance Stroll found himself in one of the most successful motorsport teams on the planet. The car he'd be driving would be the Gen 3 Daytona prototype Riley Mark 26. When the original Daytona prototype class was introduced in 2003, they ended up being slower and uglier than expected. But by 2016, the last year of the class, they had evolved into something much more respectable. The Riley Stroll would be driving was powered by a 3.5-litre Ford EcoBoost V6, producing some 600 horsepower. That very same car won the race in 2015 and had proven to be immensely successful on all the other tracks. Sharing the car with Stroll would be two-time Le Mans winner Alexander Wurz, touring car legend Andy Priaulx, and 2015 World Endurance Championship and overall prototype racing ace Brandon Hartley. So Stroll was arguably in one of the best cars in one of the best teams with some of the best co-drivers, a recipe for success. But that can be said for a lot of teams and cars on the grid. With this being the last ever Daytona 24 Hours for the Daytona prototype class, everyone was keen on getting the win. The more advanced LMP2 cars were now on equal pace as the Daytona prototypes, and a chaotic wet qualifying session showed that with enough rain, even the GT cars could end up being the fastest on track. And last but not least, there was the unique Delta Wing, which set the fastest time in the only dry practice session. Come race day, it quickly became clear that the aging Daytona prototype class wasn't quite up to speed with the competition. They could sometimes barely hang on to the LMP2 cars, but the Delta Wing was in a league of its own. So Stroll and the rest of the crew focused on keeping their head down and setting some consistent lap times. They knew their car would still be one of the most reliable out there, so staying out of trouble was the best they could do. Something that can't be said for the sister car, as that got a bit too ambitious when night fell. During the cold night, the Daytona prototypes finally got into shape as the Delta Wing had an unfortunate crash which took it out of the race, and the LMP2 cars were struggling to get their tires up to temperature. The number 2 and number 1 Ganassi cars even leading the field at one point. Lance Stroll had a pretty uneventful couple of stints, which was a good thing. This was his first time doing this kind of racing after all, and with the fastest car he'd driven yet. He was more than capable of producing lap times similar to those of his vastly more experienced co-drivers. With just a few hours left to go, the car hit trouble with Stroll behind the wheel. Stroll had been gradually climbing up the order, even taking a lap off the leading car, but a gearbox issue causing 2 lengthy pit stops dropped the car back down to 5th place. That would be the position the car would finish in the end. Still, P5 in what proved to be an extremely competitive race is nothing to be ashamed of, and doing so while being only 17 years old isn't either. It's a record Stroll still holds to this day, as a driver of that age or younger has never finished in a higher position. 2 years later, in 2018, Stroll was back at Daytona, but now for a different team. Jackie Chan DC Racing. Yes, that Jackie Chan. The team, which is run by Yota Sport, had been originally founded back in 2015 as DC Racing. Its founder, the Chinese-born American David Cheng, had got into contact with movie superstar Jackie Chan. Turns out that Jackie has a bit of a racing interest, and one of his favorite movies is the 1971 Steve McQueen Le Mans film. They soon joined forces and the Jackie Chan DC racing team was born, and they quickly started to make a name for themselves, most notably at the 2017 24 Hours of Le Mans, where they found themselves in the lead of the race after all the LMP1 cars hit trouble. It took until the final hour of the race for them to lose that lead, but nevertheless, they had made history of being the first LMP2 car to lead Le Mans, and in the end dominantly won their class and filled the second and third spot on the overall podium. They did so in what is now seen as one of the best prototype race cars of all time, the Oreca 07. And back in 2018, LMP2 cars like it were still kept on the same pace as the DPI cars, the replacement for the DP class from earlier. So again, Stroll found himself in a very competitive team with a very competitive car. His co-drivers were less experienced at prototype racing compared to the 2016 Ganassi crew, but were all very fast drivers, them being Robin Freins, Daniel Juncadella and Felix Rosenqvist. Even though Stroll and Rosenqvist were the only ones who had done the Daytona race before, the rest wasn't to be underestimated. This point was proven by Robin Freins, who put the car in P6 overall in qualifying, ahead of several factory DPI cars and the United Autosport Ligier of Norris and Alonso. In the race though, the team would be haunted by a recurring issue. All the prototypes were running on Continental tires, and for one reason or another, there were a lot of right rear tire punctures. The number 37 of Stroll got multiple failures, costing them valuable time. Trying to not ride the curbs as much to prevent any more punctures cost them some time as well. It's safe to say Continental tires weren't making friends in the paddock, especially not when they suggested some teams might be over or under inflating the tires, or filling them with nitrogen instead of regular air. When the tires stayed intact though, it's clear to see the Jackie Chan DC racing cars had some pace in them. And while Norris in the United Autosport Ligier was stealing the show in the rain, Stroll wasn't exactly slow either, seen here overtaking the overall leader to unlap himself. The rest of the drivers were posting good lap times too, and got into some exciting battles of their own. The team would hover around in the bottom half of the top 10 all race long. Trying to gain some places doing full course yellows was out of the question, as there were barely any full course yellows to begin with. Everyone was behaving themselves. While Stroll was doing his final stint in the car with just under 1 hour to go, he'd get yet another flat tire right before entering the bus stop chicane. That's one of the fastest parts of the circuit, so he did well in avoiding the tire barrier. He'd limped the car back home and emerged back from the pits in 15th position, the eventual finishing position of the car. Overall, it was a frustrating race and not reflective of Stroll's potential behind the wheel of an endurance racing car. After the race, he was quick to comment a Le Mans entry was not on the table, since that race sits right in the middle of the F1 calendar. He didn't rule out a Daytona return though, its wintertime schedule clearly being a welcome feature. Stroll's endurance racing career then only lasted 2 races and featured both sides of endurance racing, the fun one and the infuriating one. Even though he's fully focused on F1 right now, he's made it clear that he enjoys doing endurance racing. Perhaps paradoxically, he enjoyed how he could and had to push the car all the way through the stint, and didn't need to look after the tires or fuel, something you have to do in F1 all the time. Will we see Stroll make a return to endurance racing sometime in the future? Only time will tell. But his dad does own a major stake in Aston Martin after all, and we all know that brand has an unfinished business in hypercar class. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like it and subscribe if you don't want to miss out on the next one.